Hello, everybody. This is Sarkos, and thank you for joining us. Sorry, that was just me trying to play DJ as I normally do, but now I just got carried away a little. So, Module 80 in class, I mentioned that we would skip the rest of the attraction module, and I'd like for you to work on this Module 80 over this break, right? So, altruism, conflict, and peacemaking. Again, after going through those two previous modules in which we learned the worst of us, now let's end the social psychology unit with learning how we can be at our best. So the question is, when is it that we help each other? When is it that we help other people? And it's important to define, first of all, important concepts, and we're going to talk about those. One of them, main important concept of this module, is the understanding of pro-social behavior. And pro-social behavior is basically any type of behavior that is opposite to the what I named humans at our worst. So it's opposite that it's opposite in the sense that it does not bring harm to others, either physically or psychologically or verbally. It's behavior that intends to actually help and make others feel good, or better yet, it's any type of behavior that contributes to another person's well-being. So, among pro-social behaviors, we have contributing with others towards a particular goal, working in a team, collaborating, exchanging, donating. I'm just trying to come up with these on the fly, but these are types of pro-social behavior, and the reason why I'm listing them is because there is one in particular that we're going to study in this module that you need to have a very clear definition of what that is. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but also I'd like to point out another important definition or term that you should be aware of specifically, and it is bystander intervention. We'll talk about that in detail as well, and the research regarding bystander intervention. For now, it answers the question also, when is it that we are more likely to help others? And in fact, when is it that we will help others in an intervention? By intervening in an emergency situation. So I want to highlight that the concept of altruism involves any type of behavior that in which, number one, we are it's directed towards helping others, meaning we are looking for the welfare of others. Our goal is the other person's well-being. The other important essential element of this concept of altruism is unselfish regard, meaning there's no expectation of a reward. We have no actual self-interest, motivation that will be pleased by helping another person. We just do it because our goal is 100% the welfare of another human being, or in fact of an animal or any type of living being, I should say. There's much discussion about altruism. Do we do it really with a complete 100% unselfish regard for others? What about the reduction of guilt? That could be sort of, I want to feel less guilty if I help somebody in this situation. I cannot live with myself. If I know that I don't intervene here, I will not be able to live with myself. And these are quite common discussions that before entering into these debates, because it's easy sort of to become very anecdotal, very well in my case and in this case that I know about. It's important to understand the different theories from a theoretical perspective, how these different research projects, methods have studied altruism per se. And we'll talk a little about that. But I also like to point ahead of time is that altruism is closely associated as a product of social norms. It seems that we have been socialized in a way and taught in a way across cultures the reciprocity norm. And again, we have to be very careful with this, with defining reciprocity, because it's not only giving back. It's giving back. Reciprocity involves the action of returning a favor that has been given to us. We have been taught that that we should and must, and it's very compelling, help those that help us. Or more broadly, it could involve we should return a caring, a pro-social act to anybody who has acted pro-socially towards us. I include this more broad definition and perspective or lens because this happens a lot, and we're taught from the moment we are in kindergarten that if somebody invites us to a party, we should invite them to our party, to our birthday party. And this might seem very frivolous or trivial, but it's a message we're consistently receiving, a social script, as a form to say, so to speak, that compels us then to return favors. The reciprocity norm is not the same thing as a social responsibility norm. This has more to do with learning, and it's not as widespread as reciprocity. And social responsibility has to do with, think about community service. With our strong motivation to help others, even when they don't have enough, and by don't have enough could be resources, time, or money, any type of way of paying back, of reciprocating to us. So again, it's our moral obligation to help others in need, and by in need we operationalize that quality by we mean a need that they are not able to reciprocate. So in fact, reciprocity and social responsibility norms are quite different from each other. This is you need to know the name of Kitty Genovese, or Kitty Genovese, because it was the beginning of an extensive research that began with the title Bystander Apathy Study by John Darley and Bob Latney in 1964. You need to know those names, John Darley and Bob Latney. Because they are the researchers that began answering this question: when is it that we help others, and when do we not? It began with actually Kitty Genovese's case is actually a tragic case that happened here in New York City, in Queens, quite exactly. She was what I believe was a waitress. She was returning to work at 3 o'clock in the morning, around that time, and she was attacked by a rapist, and she was sexually assaulted, and she was murdered. She was stabbed. And the problem here was that, I don't know how they know this, but apparently they calculated that 38 windows because it was in the middle of an apartment complex, buildings, area, and apparently 38 windows turned lights on when they heard her screaming and her asking for help, because actually she was screaming and asking for help. 38 windows of different apartments turned on, and which sort of showed some sign of awareness. And the interesting thing here is that, and quite tragic, is that nobody called the police until, it was until 3:50 a.m. The first call was received from the police. So from 3:30, actually now I know, 3:30 a.m., I have here in my notes, up until 3:50, for 20 minutes, despite hearing Kitty Genovese scream so many times, during which she was sexually assaulted and then killed. That's what was the first time, at 3:50, 20 minutes later, was when the first call was received from the police from that area. Now, more tragically are the specifics. Kitty Genovese is sexually assaulted, and from what I understand, she was stabbed, at least initially, during this incident. The criminal, in this case, the rapist, runs from the scene and goes back and continues his attack and finally ends up murdering Kitty Genovese. This is in 1964. The fact that nobody called the police in 20 minutes might seem a little trivial for us, but it is in fact a quite long time when one is in a situation like that, actually. Despite her screaming and her requesting help, led to many people throughout the country, researchers and non-researchers, to hypothesize that this was the product of decaying, morally speaking so, New York City. That this is what urban life brought to humanity. That New Yorkers were cold, that New Yorkers didn't care about the life of others, which is quite a strong stereotype, especially outside the U.S. too. That New Yorkers basically didn't care, and that they were all in for themselves, and that is a product of a morally degraded, depraved New York City. And again, if you think of it, in a way, that is, that is an attribution. I was going to say that definitely is internal, dispositional, but if you are emphasizing the urban life, that it's a product of what urban life brings to you, maybe not that much. But again, it was a very, very popular, widespread belief. So not convinced by this that much, I would say, John Darley and Bob Lattaneg came up with a study called the Bystander Apathy Study, and it was really hard to believe that this happened. And they came up with a bystander intervention decision scheme, and we're going to talk about that. So again, and these researchers, Darley and Bob Lattaneg, studied this, wanted to find out really what took place into this type of behavior, that nobody helped Kitty Genovese in her emergency. And they created this bystander intervention decision scheme. And it basically answers the question, according to their findings, as to when is it that we are most likely to help others in distress? And what conditions will we do so? They propose this model in the form of a series of questions that any bystander, any of us in that situation would go through automatically to making the decision as to whether we will help or not. And there you have a diagram that explains this, and it says, so you see the bystander intervention decision scheme. So it's quite simple, but you must remember as to what these questions mean. So the first question is, do we notice the incident, right? That has to happen. If we do not, then nothing happens. We just continue walking our own way. In Kitty Genovese's case, of course, there was some noticing if we consider that the apartment lights were turning on, sorry. Second step is the bystander, or we as bystanders, interpreting the incident as an emergency? So there is an incident, but there needs to be some interpretation, a cognitive process there that tells us this is not just, people just screaming out of fun, or people just being intoxicated, drunk, or high, just screaming and being happy. We need to know that the person is in distress. Again, it might seem too obvious for us, but hopefully by now you can understand that we are not the most rational decision makers and thinkers, so to speak. So that would be the second question. Do we notice it as an emergency? If we do not, then nothing happens. If we do, then we go on to the third, and I would say most important step in this process is, do we as onlookers assume responsibility for helping? And here's when things get a little tricky. We'll talk a little about that. Because from here is where this phenomenon called bystander effect, that you need to know very well, emerges. But if we don't, then no help. And if we do, then that would be the third question, that would be the decisive step as in order to help somebody in distress or not. And again, I'd like to repeat that bystander intervention involves somebody in distress, somebody that needs help, usually as a matter of life or death. in this bystander intervention scheme. Darlene Latine also came up with a very interesting concept that they found throughout thousands of situations that they arranged, and this involved helping people in serious, distressful situations. Of course, they couldn't manipulate this. We all should assume that these were deceptive situations. And in other situations were just, you had to give somebody the time of the day. And again, this does not necessarily involve bystander because it's not, as I said, mentioned previously, they do not involve a life or death emergency. But my guess is they wanted to see, perhaps in situations in which there wasn't a distressful situation, if people helped or not others. So the bystander effect is simple. It is, if you are in an emergency, the more people around us, if we are in an emergency in which we need help now, the more people around us, actually, the lower chances that we will receive the help needed. You might remember when we talked about group dynamics about a concept called the diffusion of responsibility. When more people are around us and we are not directly held accountable, our sort of default mechanism or behavior is to not assume responsibility unless we are held accountable personally for this. So based on this finding, I can tell you right now that if, from a practical standpoint, at least I repeat this several times, if I'm ever in an emergency situation, I will not just ask people around me for help, I would sort of try to point towards somebody, or perhaps depending on the situation, I would grab that person by the arm, I don't know, and say, you call 911, you call the paramedics, you go to the hospital. Sort of try to hold somebody accountable based on these findings, on the bystander effect concept. Another important concept that we should understand that explains bystander effect a little better is pluralistic ignorance. This is not in your textbook, but it is very important. So please have your notes ready. Pluralistic ignorance occurs when we erroneously think that we feel differently than the rest of the group, but truly the rest of the group feels more similarly to us than we think they do. It's when we do not act upon something that is occurring in our environment because we think that we are interpreting a situation that as it only applying to us and that others see it normal. I'll give you an example. You're in class and you're in math class. It happened to me a lot in math or physics. I had to take physics 3 years in high school. It's sort of a fixed curriculum in Venezuela. Anyway, going back to the point. I hated it. I hated physics. Sorry for those physics lovers but I just don't like it at all. I can't understand it. So, the teacher is explaining a very complicated physics or math concept. And you are sitting there going through every single excruciating minute, not understanding a thing. The teacher asks, so, are there any other questions? Does everyone understand everything? Any questions? Nobody raises their hand. And we say, or at least I said many times, I'm definitely stupid. Wow, everyone else understands. I don't. So I thought that everyone else understood, when in fact, most likely, most people did not. Sometimes we get to realize this minutes after, or we talk to a friend, we go to a study group, and then we realize that people were understanding even, less than we were understanding. Yet, the fear of looking stupid in front of others kept us from raising our hand. But what was really happening, and so we think that we are the only ones we say to ourselves, well, if others didn't understand, they would raise their hand. After all, I don't know, Bob and John and Peter are more outgoing than I am. So I know they would raise their hand if they understood, or I inferred that. I'm just a shy person. I'm not going to do that. So for whatever reason it might be, that's not particular to pluralistic ignorance, but what's essential here to understanding this phenomenon is to say, well, we disagree with the norm. In this case, the norm is raise your hand if you don't understand anything. We disagree with it, but we think that this disagreement with raising your hand when you don't understand something only applies to us. But truly, it's applying to everybody else. Everyone else is not understanding, or most of the class is not understanding, but they don't behave. They also disagree with the norm privately. Privately would be a key word there to understanding pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance in social psychology research is social psychologists, in another way. Social psychologists think about a lot about drinking on campuses. The amount of drinking that goes on in U.S. campuses is quite abnormal. I think I read once that it's perhaps the highest worldwide. There's a lot of debate on this, whether, the U.S. is also the country in the world that has the highest, I think, age for someone to drink legally. So there is much to say about that, but this is a psychology class, not a sociology class. I think the topic is very interesting as to how age of consent and sort of influences drinking behavior. But the point is that on college campuses, at least from other countries, it is viewed as quite interesting, the fact that this binge drinking tendency is quite, in a way, fascinating to watch. But, so going back to pluralistic ignorance, this type of binge drinking, although prevalent in most colleges and universities, most students that arrive to college campuses, many of you in a year, you might think, wow, people drink here a lot, much more than I am ever capable of drinking, doing so, right? But you think, or you will think, that you are the only one that sort of is amazed by this, because others are acting quite normally. In fact, they did this study in which they asked fraternity males to calculate how much they thought their fraternal brothers drank, and they always overestimated it based on their perception of others. So truly, most people think that others just have a different attitude to them. They are ignorant to the fact that they have the rest of the group thinks very similarly to them. And this is, again, pluralistic ignorance. There are other studies also done with fraternity brothers in which this also happens with sex. They overestimate the amount of casual sex that their fraternal brothers are having much over than the sex that they are really having. And this is also pluralistic ignorance. And as you might see, going back to the bystander effect, here, I want you to think a little bit about how it also interferes, because it's different from diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility just leads to social loafing, like, okay, I just don't want to deal with this right now. Another person will do that. Here, it's more, I see everybody not helping, but maybe it's because I think the person needs help, but maybe that's just me. Maybe because I'm not seeing that anyone's helping. So the norm must be not to help, despite me disagreeing. I think that she or he does need help. So, wow, that was an automatic bias there, as you just noticed. And I want to lead by example here. I assumed it was a person that needs help. So I apologize. And so he or she needs help. And therefore, I think that, well, it was just me maybe, or it is me that thinks that person deserves help. Pluralistic ignorance, diffusion of responsibility, as they influence the bystander effect. These are very straightforward. In addition to the bystander effect, Darley and Latané's study also came up with these very specific factors that interfere in us helping others or not. Some of them are common sense, yes, a little troubling, if I were allowed to be subjective on the matter. First, we are more to help others, and these you need to know by heart, guys. Please remember that. First of all, I added truly there, this has to do with the bystander intervention scheme, if we notice the incident as an emergency. So we need to know, we first notice the emergency and notice, therefore, that that person needs help and deserves the help. I was trying to find more literature on this in terms of deserve, but my guess is that if we see somebody who is homeless, our first tendency might be, and this may have to do a lot with blame the victim bias, if they are homeless, it's because they deserve it. Therefore, they don't really deserve the help, because you know how many people rationalize this as if, oh, I'm just rewarding the homeless behavior, like it's really easy to be out there on the streets in the cold. But again, we're humans and we are going to try to justify us having more than others. So I'm pretty sure that is what is inferred by, or that's what they mean by deserving help. The other second interesting, fascinating, and little troubling factor that will make us more or less likely to help others is that they need to be similar to us. And remember, when we're talking about similarity in social psychology, we go to two areas, that is gender and race or ethnicity. And in this case, it has to do with ethnicity and / race. We will tend to help others more. The chances are, odds are much higher if the person in need of help or the person in distress is somebody of a similar race or ethnicity as I am. So we might not see ourselves as being like that, and I'm sure our first reaction, in fact, for me, I hesitate as I say it because it's really difficult to digest. But again, as an alleviating note, I have to add that, again, we're talking about tendencies, we're talking about automatic reactions, we're talking about seconds. So please keep that in mind. My question would be, I think an interesting question, is how this connects with the first one, deserving to help, as in terms of socioeconomics and stereotypes associated with socioeconomics and race. So, but again, we can discuss that in class. The other factor is very important, is that the bystander is not in a hurry. He's going to tend to help more. If we as bystanders are on time, we're not rushing to some class or to some job that will start soon, or that we're running late for a meeting or anything, then we're going to help. We're going to be more likely to help a person in distress. This has to do with the previous slide. If we live in a small town or rural area, actually bystanders are going to help more. And I think that by living in an more isolated area, less dense area than a city, I think there are, of course, there's going to be these situations, because of population reasons, there's going to be fewer chances for a diffusion of responsibility, meaning there's going to be sort of a more stronger sense of accountability that we're prone to. So think about it. That is sort of against our common sense, I'd say. When I studied this, when I read about this the first time, I always thought that the more people around us in an emergency would help us. We would have a higher chance of surviving. Interesting that regardless of whether we are male and female, or regardless of whether we identify with any of these genders, we are going to help more. Our tendency to help others is going to be higher or stronger when the victim or the person in distress is a woman. Also, our chances of helping others is going to increase if we are in a good mood. And I think this is tied into the next one, but again, you have to memorize these or learn these separately. If we are not preoccupied, by preoccupied, I've always had trouble understanding preoccupied because in Spanish it means something similar but different. In Spanish it is concerned, to be concerned, not necessarily about ourselves, but to be concerned about something, estás preocupado. But in English, I understand that preoccupied is that you're thinking about, it has more of a negative connotation, and it's more like it's a self-centered thinking, like you're really distracted because you're thinking about something about yourself, I believe. So basically, if the focus of your attention is not on you, because of something situational perhaps going on in your life. Perhaps you just received the bad news, or I don't know, a breakup, or you just learned that you got a bad grade. So I think those are situations, correct me if I'm wrong, that are going to lead to preoccupation as opposed to having your focus of thought towards others around you. We are also, very interesting too, we are also going to be much more likely. Now remember, these are not slight differences. These are statistical, significant differences. We are going to be much more likely to help others if we recently observed someone else. Hopefully you can connect this to other concepts that I've been emphasizing in class, and I'll ask you in a bit. And then finally, if we are guilty about anything, non-related to the event, but we're simply experiencing guilt, we are going to be much more likely to help somebody in distress. You need to know these. Please make sure you do. Perhaps I could give extra credit for somebody who comes up with an acronym with these. A mnemonic with these. So if you come up with one that'll help, I'll be willing to give you guys some extra credit for the exam. So let's make that official. All right? Send any ideas my way.